never tasted so good. Sugar never tasted so good. Sugar never tasted good to me.
And when they had planted a crown of thorns, they put it upon his head, and a reed in his right hand. And they bowed the knee before him, and mocked him, saying, Hail, King of the Jews. Hey, kids. Welcome back to the Nathan Sandell podcast. I'm your host, Nathan Sandell, and I just opened the podcast with, obviously, a Bible quote, Jesus. It's Matthew 27:29. Now, part of the quote, the important part for our podcast today at least, is the part where they say, and a reed in his right hand. A reed. Reed like sugarcane. Yes, well, sugarcane and reeds have been important for millennia. I mean, here's proof right here that they were important in Jesus' time. And they're important now still, but in a different way. Today's podcast is going to be looking how in the near future, having caned reeds for musicians could be a thing of the past. Musicians have been using modern cane reeds since the mid-1800s, at least around there, and they've been the standard for well over 100 years now for woodwind instruments. Alternatives do exist, but are very limited, including plastic-covered reeds, which are just reeds that are coated in plastic, the standard cane ones, or synthetic reeds made entirely out of plastic, which we'll get into later. Because reeds are essential in the playing of a vast majority of woodwind instruments, basically all of them, besides maybe your harmonica, demand has always been high for them. This leads into how reeds are actually produced, and that would be in the far, far away regions of France.
What a feeling that's begun. What a feeling that's begun.
I'd like to start by saying that most all of the info on this podcast is provided by the wonderful people at the Van Doren Music Company, which gratefully answered any inquiries that I had emailed to them. The cane of Provence is what they call the cane grown for reeds in southern France, and it's specifically part of the Arindodonax family of reed. Now, they grow these reeds, and they're like 10 feet tall, just originally it's the green bushes. Like when you think of sugar cane, that's what they grow them. But when they grow them specifically for musical reeds, 90% of the original plant gets rejected. 90% of that plant that they grow cannot be used. And then after harvesting and whittling it down, another 5% of that leftover 10% gets rejected. So essentially, 5% of that huge 10-foot stalk is only actually used in the musical reed at the end of the day. The rest of it more or less goes to waste. They claim that they use part of it to heat their factories, but I'm not sure how effective that really is and how much there really is to that, considering that the burn time has to be incredibly short as it's just a water-based plant. So, because of this, and the thicker circumference that is needed specifically for the reeds, they can't have super thin ones. This causes them that they have to plant them somewhat far away from each other, because if they plant them too close, then they'll be way too thin. If they plant them of course, too far away, then it's not effective at all. So they use a lot of room, like a lot of growing space to plant the reeds. So instead of think of corn, when you go to the corn maze, all the corn is super close, tight packed together. They can't do that with the reeds, or else they'll be too skinny. The circumference will be too small. So they take up a ton of actual ground, physical land to be grown. Now, because not everyone can afford that land, and because not everyone has the name that Van Doren does, it creates a pretty severe exclusivity market with reeds. Now, Van Doren, the company, essentially has a monopoly on the high-end reed process. Other manufacturers do exist, like Juno and Rico, but those reeds are sort of seen as beginner reeds. Like if you go to an elementary school or middle school, or even early high school, you'll see Rico reeds and Juno reeds because it's just the cheaper alternative. And with the price, there is a correlation between price and quality there. When you go out to buy a box of reeds, specifically a box of 5 baritone saxophone reeds, it costs you about $40 for one box of 5 reeds, which is essentially double what you would purchase for Rico or Juno reeds. So not only is Van Doren, with these practices, being pretty incredibly wasteful with the process of reed creation just because of its nature, but they also drive out competition. I mean, essentially having a monopoly on higher reed. Like, there's no one else that can really, when you think of high reed production and like high quality manufacturing, when you say Rico, people don't consider that high quality. If you say Juno, people think the same way. They're like, oh, it's sort of like a third brand, like or whatever. Like, not that big of a deal to us.
And her thoughts like a daisy. How my mind gets lazy. I must have been crazy not to see.
So, now that I've laid out the production of standard plant-based reeds, let's take a look at the opposite on the spectrum. Synthetic reeds, the one I mentioned earlier, are made out of a blend of plastics in the shape of a traditional reed. This obviously renders them more durable as they're made of plastic, but also drastically changes the timbre of the whole range. It becomes a lot brighter and more unforgiving. It's actually like preferable in most cases to traditional cane reeds if you're looking at drum corps, marching band, or like really loud and abrasive funk and rock music. Those can all benefit from having a synthetic reed, but most professional, in fact, I'd say probably most every professional musician, at least the ones I've met, still hold that the warmer and cleaner sound that you can get out of a traditional cane just cannot be replicated by plastic. Because, I mean, the sound for a woodwind instrument starts with the vibration of the reed. Everything comes back to the reed. So if you have a cracked reed or a chipped reed, it's going to sound bad. Therefore, because everything starts with it, if it's changed, especially so drastically with cane to plastic, it can not ruin, but certainly change the tonal sound as a whole. Which means that not only that the plastics, I suppose like the other reeds, will be thrown in a landfill, eventually after they're done. Like I said, reed gets chipped, you drop it or whatever. They'll be thrown to a landfill, which can take decades to return to the earth. Like, if you take your regular cane reed and throw it on the ground, it's made of plant material. It's going to decay like an apple core. But these plastic reeds, they're not going to do that. They're going to be around for probably as long as you have, which is an essential downside to using plastic reeds.
What a feeling that's begun. What a feeling that's begun. Alright.
Now, this leads to the question then. How do you play a woodwind while still being environmentally friendly? Well, as a baritone saxophonist myself, every time I open up a box of reeds, made of paper, the box, that is, and then I open up plastic packaging that the case is in, and then I take the reed out of the plastic case itself, I realize that more plastic is actually used in the preservation and packaging of standard cane reeds than synthetic ones. You have the box, then you have a plastic wrapper, it is essentially, and then a plastic case it comes in. However, I just can't deny that plant-based reeds are an absolute cornerstone of the medium. It's like trying to build new tires for a car without using rubber. I suppose while substitutes do exist, there's a reason that everyone uses rubber. Their effectiveness just can't be denied. The one holdout that we can hope for, however, is genetically modified cane to eventually produce reeds that can be totally used instead of wasting 95% of the plant matter. Just as food has been grown to almost essential perfection, I don't see why reeds and sugarcane production cannot be streamlined the way. The only thing that's holding, first off, other companies back from doing this is, like I mentioned before, the monopoly that Van Doren holds over essentially the entire industry. And two, because Van Doren has a monopoly, there's no need to innovate. There's no need for them to get up their production because, I mean, what they have now for their business is fine, and they don't see any reason to change because, well, hey, we've been making these reeds for 100 years, and sure, we might abuse hundreds of acres for them, but they sell, people buy them, and they don't really have anywhere else to get them, so, what's the point of spending money to try to grow more effective reeds when we'll just chuck it in the bin, 95%, and it's all good and well. That's why we can, as people, push for Van Doren and other reed companies to be more environmentally friendly. Like, do the reeds really need to come in 3 layers of plastic? I don't think so. I understand that they've been grown or whatever for 2 years and blah, 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 but I don't really buy any of that stuff. I think that they can still make effective reeds without having to use so much plastic in the landfills. I'd like to thank our sponsor for this episode, Audible. Clearly you like listening to things, as you just listened to this amazing podcast. And would you believe it? Audible is an audiobook service. You can listen to books. You might ask how the book actually makes noise, but they don't. It's okay. Someone reads to you. Not in real time. It's a recording. Don't worry. Sign up for an Audible subscription today. Use my code SANDEL32 to get months, a single month, not multiple months, a single month's free trial and 3 audiobooks of your choice. This is Nathan Sandell signing off. Tune in next week to hear about how the White Stripes reunion could bring about the return of Jesus Christ himself.
Water never tasted so good. Water never tasted